A wedding ring sits abandoned on a marble table. Rain hammers against stained glass windows. Somewhere in the darkness, a woman is crying. Not the bride, not a guest, but the maid who cleaned these floors for 3 years, now standing outside the gates with everything she owns in a single torn bag. They say he left his wife for her. They say love made him do it. But the truth? The truth is so much more devastating than anyone in that mansion could have imagined. What you're about to hear isn't just a love story. It's a warning about secrets, choices, and the price we pay when we confuse our deepest desires with something else entirely. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 years earlier, a young woman named Emma stepped through the servants' entrance of the Hartwell estate for the first time. She was 24, rail-thin from skipping meals to save money, with hands already rough from years of work. Emma had grown up poor, in a house with peeling paint and a roof that leaked when it rained hard. Her father had died when she was 16, leaving her mother Sarah to raise her and her younger brother alone. Now Sarah was sick. Really sick. The kind of sick where doctors use words like aggressive and limited options and avoid making eye contact. Emma had dropped out of community college to work full-time, trying everything from waitressing to cleaning offices at night. Nothing paid enough. When her mother's former employer mentioned the Hartwell family needed household staff, Emma didn't hesitate. The salary was nearly double what she'd been making. It meant living on the estate 6 days a week, sleeping in a small room above the garage, seeing her family only on Sundays. But it also meant her mother could afford her medications. It meant her brother could stay in school. So Emma said yes, packed her few belongings, and became invisible. That's what good staff did in houses like this. They became part of the furniture, present but unnoticed, efficient but silent. The master of the house was Michael Hartwell, 38, heir to a commercial real estate empire built by his grandfather. He had the kind of face you'd see in business magazines: strong jaw, careful smile, eyes that revealed nothing. His wife Victoria was a former marketing executive who now sat on charity boards and hosted fundraisers. She was beautiful in that calculated way. Everything from her honey blonde highlights to her Pilates-toned arms suggesting effort disguised as effortlessness. They had no children, which the other staff whispered about in the kitchen late at night. They'd been married for 8 years. From the outside, they were perfection itself. But Emma learned quickly that the outside rarely tells the whole story. She noticed things during her first weeks at the estate. The way Michael and Victoria barely spoke at breakfast, both absorbed in their phones. How Victoria's laugh during dinner parties sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in front of a mirror. The separate bedrooms, explained away as Michael's insomnia and Victoria's light sleeping. The coldness in Victoria's voice when she gave Emma instructions, not unkind exactly, but distant, as if Emma were a piece of equipment rather than a person. Emma kept her head down. She cleaned the endless rooms, polished silver that would be used once and stored away, arranged flowers in vases that cost more than her monthly salary. She sent most of her paycheck home and lived on staff meals and the knowledge that her mother's pain was being managed, that her brother was passing his classes. She didn't allow herself to want anything more. The shift happened so gradually that Emma didn't notice it at first. It started with small moments. Michael coming into the kitchen for coffee while Emma was preparing breakfast, thanking her by name instead of with a distracted nod. Him asking how her day off had been, actually listening when she mentioned visiting her mother. A conversation about books when he found her reading during her lunch break in the garden. He'd read the same book. They talked for 20 minutes about the ending, whether the protagonist had made the right choice. Emma had felt nervous afterward, worried she'd overstepped. But the next week, he left a newer book on the kitchen counter with a note saying she might enjoy it. It was small. It shouldn't have meant anything. But to Emma, who'd been invisible for so long. Being seen felt like sunlight after winter. The conversations became more frequent. Michael started finding excuses to be in whatever room Emma was working in. He'd ask about her family, her life before the estate, her dreams beyond the present moment. Emma found herself opening up in ways she hadn't with anyone in years. She told him about her father's death, how guilty she felt for not being able to save her mother from the same disease. She told him about the college classes she'd had to abandon, her love for literature and history, subjects that felt like luxuries now. Michael listened with an intensity that made her uncomfortable and thrilled in equal measure. He shared things too, fragments of a life that looked perfect but felt empty. The pressure of living up to his family's legacy. The loneliness of a marriage that was more business partnership than love. How he felt like he was playing a role in his own life rather than actually living it. Emma knew she should have pulled back. She knew the dangerous territory they were entering. But there was something intoxicating about being needed, not just for what she could clean or cook, but for who she was. For the first time in her adult life, someone was treating her like she mattered. It's so easy to judge from the outside, to say she should have been stronger, smarter, more aware of consequences. But when you've spent years making yourself small, when you've swallowed your own needs until you've almost forgotten you have them, the first person who looks at you like you're valuable becomes everything. 6 months into working at the estate, Emma realized she was in love with Michael. Not the sudden, dramatic kind of love from movies, but a slow accumulation of moments that had built into something she couldn't ignore. The way her heart jumped when she heard his footsteps. How his smile could change her entire day. She tried to suppress it. She avoided him when she could, took extra shifts that kept her in different parts of the house. But Michael noticed. He sought her out more deliberately. 8 months in, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Victoria was at a charity luncheon and the other staff had their day off, Michael found Emma in the library. They started talking, and then talking became something else. He told her he was falling in love with her, that she made him feel alive for the first time in years, that his marriage had been dead long before she arrived, that he and Victoria had been pretending for so long they'd forgotten what real connection felt like. Emma knew she should have said no, should have reminded him of his vows, her job, the impossible situation they were creating. But she didn't, because she was 24 and in love and tired of being invisible. Because for once, someone wanted her, not despite who she was, but because of it. They began an affair. Secret meetings in parts of the estate where no one went. Stolen hours when Victoria was away. Text messages deleted immediately after being sent. It was reckless and selfish and wrong, and Emma knew it. The guilt ate at her constantly. But the guilt couldn't compete with the feeling of being chosen, of matching to someone. For 3 months, they existed in this bubble. Michael talked about leaving Victoria, about starting over, about a life where they didn't have to hide. Emma let herself believe it might be possible. She imagined a future that didn't involve cleaning other people's houses, where she could finish her education, where her mother could meet the man she loved without shame. It was a fantasy, but it felt so close to real. Then Victoria found out. Not because Michael told her, not because Emma confessed, but because Victoria was far more observant than either of them had given her credit for. She'd noticed the way Michael looked at Emma, the change in his mood, the sudden interest in being home more often. She'd hired a private investigator who documented everything with photographs and detailed reports. Victoria's confrontation was ice-cold and strategic. She didn't yell or throw things or cry. She sat Michael down in his office, laid out the evidence, and gave him a choice. End it immediately, publicly fire Emma with a severance package and non-disclosure agreement, and they would continue their marriage as if nothing had happened. Or she would divorce him, and in the process make sure that every business associate, every family member, every person in their social circle knew exactly what had happened. She would paint Emma as a gold-digging manipulator and Michael as a fool who'd risked everything for his housemaid. She would ensure his reputation was destroyed so thoroughly that even his family's legacy couldn't save him. Michael chose Emma. He filed for divorce the next week, moved out of the estate into an apartment downtown. He asked Emma to move in with him, told her they were finally free to be together without hiding. Emma should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt terrified, because the moment their relationship became public, everything changed. Victoria's prediction came true with devastating accuracy. The story spread through their social circles like wildfire. Wealthy businessman leaves wife for the maid. It was tabloid-worthy gossip, and people devoured it. Michael's business partners began distancing themselves. Deals that had seemed certain fell through. His mother called Michael's choice a disgrace to the family name and threatened to remove him from several board positions. But the worst of it fell on Emma. She became the villain in a story she'd never wanted to be part of. Social media posts called her a homewrecker, a gold digger, worse. Her face appeared on gossip websites with headlines that made her sick to read. Someone found her mother's address and sent hate mail. Her brother was harassed at school. Friends from her old life stopped returning her calls. Emma's mother, weak from illness but strong in conviction, told Emma she'd made a terrible mistake. Not because of morality or judgment, but because she knew how the world worked. She knew that when wealthy men fall, they have safety nets. But women like Emma, they just fall. Michael tried to shield her from it. He was loving and attentive, promising that once the divorce was finalized, once the gossip died down, they'd start their real life together. He'd find new business opportunities. They'd move somewhere fresh. Her family would come around. Emma wanted to believe him, but doubt was creeping in, cold and persistent. For months after Michael moved out, his lawyer called with news. Victoria was fighting the divorce with everything she had. She wasn't asking for alimony or making financial demands. She was making it as expensive, lengthy, and public as possible. Deposition after deposition. Court dates that got postponed. Legal bills that climbed into six figures. Michael's stress became visible. He started drinking more, sleeping less. The pressure of watching his reputation crumble, his business suffer, his family turn against him, it was taking a toll. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way he looked at Emma began to change. The adoration was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Resentment? Regret? She couldn't quite name it, but she could feel it. They started fighting. Small arguments about money, about when they could see her family, about the future that kept getting further away instead of closer. Michael never said it directly, but Emma could sense the unspoken question hanging between them. Was this worth it? Their apartment, nice by Emma's standards but modest by Michael's, started feeling like a cage. He'd given up so much to be with her. His wife, his home, his standing in the community. And what did they have to show for it? Love? Love didn't pay the bills when business deals fell through. Love didn't silence the whispers at restaurants when people recognized them. Love didn't fix the fact that Emma's mother was getting worse and Emma couldn't afford to help because she'd lost her job and Michael's finances were tied up in legal fees. 9 months after the affair became public, Emma realized something that made her stomach drop. Michael hadn't just fallen in love with her. He'd fallen in love with who he thought she was. The sweet, simple girl who'd looked at him like he was a hero. The woman who'd represented escape from his complicated life. But now that they were living in the reality of that escape, now that the fantasy had collided with actual consequences, she wasn't that person anymore. She was stressed, anxious, angry about the unfairness of how differently they were being treated by the world. She'd stopped being his refuge and started being a reminder of everything he'd lost. Emma could feel him slipping away, not all at once, but in degrees. Coming home later, being less present in conversations. The way he'd flinch slightly when someone recognized them in public. She knew what was coming before it happened. 10 months after leaving Victoria, Michael sat Emma down and told her he'd made a mistake. Not in loving her. He was careful to emphasize that. But in thinking that love alone could be enough to rebuild a life from scratch. He was exhausted from the legal battle, from the financial strain, from being cut off from everything familiar. His family had made it clear that reconciliation was possible, but only if he ended things with Emma. Victoria had apparently indicated she might be willing to pause the divorce proceedings if Michael came back. Not because she loved him, but because saving face mattered more than anything else. Michael told Emma he still cared about her, that these months together had been real, but he couldn't keep losing everything. He was going back to Victoria. Emma didn't cry during that conversation. She'd run out of tears weeks ago. She just nodded, started packing her things into the same bag she'd brought to the Hartwell estate 2 years earlier, and left. No dramatic scene, no begging, just the quiet exit of someone who'd known all along that this was how it would end. She moved back in with her mother, into the house with peeling paint and a leaking roof. Her mother was too sick by then to say "I told you so," but Emma could see it in her eyes. Not judgment exactly, but sadness for a daughter who'd learned a hard lesson the expensive way. Emma couldn't find work. Her name was too recognizable now, associated with scandal. No one wanted to hire the woman who'd been in the news for having an affair with her employer. She took whatever odd job she could get, paid under the table, nothing with security or benefits. Her brother had become distant, embarrassed by the family's notoriety. 3 months after Michael left her, Emma's mother died. The cancer that Emma had been trying so hard to fight with those Hartwell estate paychecks finally won. Emma sat at the small funeral, attended by a handful of relatives who either pitied or blamed her, and realized that every choice she'd made for the past 2 years had been for nothing. She hadn't saved her mother. She hadn't secured a better future. She'd traded her integrity and her privacy for a love story that was never really hers to begin with. Now here's where the story takes its turn. For months after her mother's death, Emma was working a catering job at a hotel downtown. She was clearing plates from a conference room when she overheard a conversation. 2 women in expensive suits were discussing a legal case. One of them mentioned the Hartwell divorce, how it had finally been settled. Emma froze, unable to help herself from listening. Michael had reconciled with Victoria, the woman was saying. They'd done a whole social media campaign about second chances and fighting for marriage. Very calculated, very public. But here was the interesting part. Victoria had apparently known about the affair much earlier than she'd let on. She'd suspected something 6 months before she'd confronted Michael. The private investigator had been documenting everything that entire time. Victoria had waited deliberately, let the affair deepen, let Michael become more emotionally invested. Why? Because she'd wanted leverage. She'd wanted Michael to be so far in that leaving would be his idea, that he'd be the one to blow up their life publicly. That way she could play the wronged wife, gain sympathy, and still maintain control. She'd even apparently encouraged Michael's business troubles by quietly warning certain associates to distance themselves, making it look like natural consequences when it was actually strategic sabotage. And the reconciliation? That had been the plan all along. Let Michael lose everything. Let him see how hard life was outside the protection of wealth and status, then offer him a way back. But only on her terms. The divorce settlement had given Victoria complete control over their shared assets. Michael had signed away decision-making power in their business interests. He'd agreed to therapy, to public statements, to essentially becoming the rehabilitated husband in Victoria's carefully constructed narrative. He'd gotten his life back, but he'd lost himself in the process. Emma stood there in her catering uniform, holding a tray of empty glasses, and felt something shift inside her. She'd spent months thinking she was the villain, the homewrecker who'd destroyed a marriage. But the marriage had already been destroyed. It had been a performance, and she'd been cast as a plot device in someone else's story. Victoria had used Emma just as much as Emma had thought she was choosing love. Michael had used Emma as an escape, a fantasy that let him feel alive without actually changing anything fundamental about himself. And Emma? Emma had used them too, if she was being honest. She'd seen Michael as her rescue, the solution to all her problems. She'd let herself believe that his attention meant she was valuable, that his love could fill the holes in her life that had nothing to do with him. Everyone had been using everyone else, and the only person who'd played it smart was Victoria, who'd understood from the beginning that love was just another form of currency in their world. Emma finished her shift, went home to the house that now felt emptier than ever, and made a decision. She was done being part of other people's stories. She was done making herself small or letting others decide her value. She used the small severance package Victoria had given her, guilty money, to ensure Emma signed an NDA to enroll in online classes. She moved to a smaller town 2 hours away where no one knew her name or her story. She took a job at a library, quiet work with books in silence, and people who didn't ask questions. She went to therapy, finally addressing the grief and guilt and complicated feelings she'd been carrying. She sent her brother a letter apologizing for the mess she'd created, not expecting forgiveness, just offering it. Slowly, painfully, she started rebuilding. Not the fantasy life she'd imagined with Michael, but something more sustainable. A life built on her own choices, her own work, her own definition of what mattered. 2 years later, Emma was sitting in a coffee shop, studying for an exam. She'd gone back to school, working toward the degree she'd abandoned. It was hard juggling work and classes and the constant financial stress, but it was hers. She'd earned every piece of it. A woman sat down at the next table, and Emma glanced up out of habit. It was Victoria, older, thinner, with new lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Their eyes met. Emma's first instinct was to leave, to avoid the confrontation or awkwardness or whatever this moment would become. But Victoria spoke first. "Emma, right?" As if she didn't know exactly who Emma was. Victoria gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Do you have a minute?" Against her better judgment, Emma said yes. They sat there, two women who'd never really talked despite being at the center of the same storm. And Victoria did something Emma never expected. She apologized, not for the social destruction or the calculated manipulation. Victoria didn't apologize for winning the game she'd been playing. She apologized for making Emma a piece in that game without Emma understanding the rules. "I knew what I was doing," Victoria said, stirring a coffee she wasn't drinking. "I knew Michael was unhappy. I knew he'd probably have an affair eventually. When I realized it was you, I saw an opportunity." Emma should have been angry. She was a little, but mostly she was just tired. "Why are you telling me this?" Victoria smiled, but it was sad. "Because I won. I got everything I wanted. Michael came back. I have control. My reputation is intact. But you know what I realized? I don't have a marriage. I have a contract. I have a husband who resents me. I have a life that looks perfect and feels like a tomb." She paused, looking directly at Emma. "You lost everything. Your job, your reputation, your mother. But you got out. You're actually living. And I'm still in that house, pretending." Emma didn't know what to say. There was no comfort to offer, no wisdom that would fix what Victoria had built around herself. So she just said the truth. "We both made choices. I don't think either of us gets to be the victim or the villain. We're just people who hurt each other while trying not to hurt ourselves." Victoria nodded slowly. She stood up, preparing to leave, then turned back. "For what it's worth, I hope you finish your degree. I hope you build something real." She walked out, and Emma never saw her again. But that conversation stayed with her. It helped Emma understand something crucial about what had happened. The affair wasn't a love story gone wrong. It was what happens when people try to solve their problems through other people instead of facing what's actually broken in their own lives. Michael hadn't loved Emma. He'd loved the idea of escaping his emptiness. Emma hadn't loved Michael, not really. She'd loved being seen, being chosen, feeling valuable. Victoria hadn't been protecting her marriage. She'd been protecting her investment in an image. They'd all been so focused on their own needs and fears that they'd turned each other into objects, tools to get what they wanted. And the damage from that, the real cost, it fell on everyone. 3 years after the affair ended, Emma graduated with her degree. Her brother came to the ceremony, their relationship slowly mending. She'd built a small life, modest but stable. She dated occasionally but carefully, more interested in understanding herself than in finding someone to complete her. She volunteered at a shelter, helping women who'd made similar mistakes, who'd lost themselves in other people's stories. She shared her experience, not as a confession, but as a map of where the pitfalls were. She'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Michael and Victoria eventually divorced anyway. The reconciliation had lasted 3 years before the facade became too exhausting to maintain. Michael had apparently moved to another state, taken a job with one of his family's secondary companies. Victoria had remarried, this time to someone closer to her own age and temperament. A business arrangement she'd apparently learned to appreciate without pretending it was more. Sometimes Emma still thought about those days at the Hartwell estate. The conversations in the library, the feeling of being wanted. But mostly what she remembered was the lesson. That love, real love, doesn't ask you to abandon yourself. It doesn't thrive in secrecy or feed on other people's pain. Real love is built in daylight, with honest words and hard choices, and the willingness to face consequences together. What she'd had with Michael wasn't love. It was need disguised as love, desperation painted in romantic colors. And once she'd stopped confusing the two, once she'd stopped looking for someone else to save her or validate her or give her life meaning, she'd finally started to find actual peace. The story doesn't have a fairy tale ending because real life rarely does. Emma didn't end up wealthy or famous or even particularly happy in the way stories promise. But she ended up free. Free from the need to be chosen by someone else. Free from the belief that her worth was determined by who wanted her. Free to build a life on her own terms, even if that life was smaller and quieter than she'd once dreamed. And maybe that's the real lesson here. That sometimes the happy ending isn't about getting what you wanted. It's about surviving what you wanted, learning from it, and building something better from the wreckage. So here's what I want you to think about. If you were Emma, at what point would you have walked away? Would you have said no to Michael from the beginning? Or would you have let yourself believe that love was enough to justify the damage? If you were Michael, could you have fixed your marriage instead of looking for escape in someone else? Could you have been honest about your unhappiness without destroying lives? And if you were Victoria, would you have handled the betrayal differently? Would you have fought for your marriage genuinely? Or would you have let it go? These aren't easy questions. They don't have simple answers. Because real life is messy and complicated and full of choices that seem right in the moment but look different in hindsight. Comment below and tell me where you stand. Tell me if you think Emma was a victim or if she made her own choices. Tell me if Michael deserves sympathy or judgment. Tell me if Victoria was protecting herself or punishing everyone else. And if you believe that every person in this story was both right and wrong, both hurt and hurting, tell me that too. Because that's probably closest to the truth. If this story made you think, if it challenged you or moved you or made you uncomfortable, subscribe to this channel. We tell stories that don't have easy answers. Stories about real people making complicated choices. Stories that stay with you long after they end. And next time, we'll tell you about something even more shocking. About a man who thought he'd found his soulmate, only to discover that the woman he loved had a secret that would change everything he thought he knew about trust, identity, and the lies we tell to protect ourselves. You won't want to miss it.